Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I apologize again for the slight delay in our start, but we're ready to go now. We have a lot to do, so thank you very much for being here with us. My name is Christine Muir. I am the community librarian at Cary Library. I am delighted to be part of this program. There's a lot going on here and there's a lot of interest, so thank you to everyone who coordinated it for letting me be a partner with you. Thank you to everyone who has ever made a donation to the Cary Library Foundation, as that supports all of our programming. I am recording tonight's program and it will be available on the library's YouTube channel by the end of the week. If you've registered for the program, you will get a copy of that link so that you can watch it later or share it with anybody else who might be interested. There will be some time for question and answer with our presenters tonight. So I would ask that you please use the Q&A feature specifically for that purpose. If you have a question for me regarding technology, process, timing, something that I can answer, please use chat and I will respond to you immediately. If you have a question for one of our presenters, please use the Q&A feature. That will make it easier for us to manage what questions have been asked and which ones haven't been yet. If we don't get to all the questions tonight, we will offer some contact information for you to be able to reach out for further information after this event. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Rick Reebstein, who was one of the people that coordinated this. And thank you for having me, Rick, and thanks for being here and introducing everyone.
Thank you for your help, Christine. Everyone, the library is really a great asset for the town. This event has its origins in discussions at the Sustainable Lexington Committee meetings, and Charlie Wyman and Marcia Gens are on that committee with me. And we decided that the Lexington Sustainability Action Plan really isn't going to be a good plan unless it does something about trees. And some time ago, not that long ago, Mark Sandine, select board member and author of All Things Sustainable, had Professor William Moomaw from Tufts come speak at the library. We were very impressed with what he had to say about trees. So we've asked him to come back and we're going to hear from him first. He's one of the authors of, lead authors of the IPCC reports, International Panel on Climate Change. As well as many other things that are impressive to anyone who cares about an career of an environmental professional. After him, we're going to hear from Robert O'Connor. And Robert has worked for the state of Massachusetts for a long time, and he's well known in the conservation field. After that, we're going to hear from the DPW, Dave Pinsino, DPW chief, and Christopher Filodoro, our tree warden. And finally, we'll close with a few short remarks from Jerry Paul, who is the chair of the tree committee. Now, without any further ado, I would like to turn it over to our main speakers, Bill Moomaw first, and then Robert O'Connor. Thank you for being with us today, Professor Moomaw.
Thank you. And I just want to say it's nice to be on a panel with Bob O'Connor again. We worked together about a dozen years ago on the Forest Futures Visioning plan for Massachusetts, and there's been a lot, and trees fortunately have been growing during that time, which is a good thing. Let me get my presentation up here, share my screen, and then let me do the slideshow here. Oh, come on. For some reason, I can't. Oh, here we are. Now, there it will start. Okay. All right, let me, this great title for this event, Stand for Trees, and I added Lexington just to be sure that we all know where we are. I just went to Google Earth and discovered here's Lexington. The red outline outlines Lexington. And from this Google Earth photo, you can see you can see that there are areas of trees in Lexington, which is obviously important. And if you come down a little bit, we can see that Lexington does have trees. They grow throughout the town. There are several categories of trees, and I want to talk about those different categories as we go through this. There are town trees, like this beautiful scene here from Lexington Green, and there are country trees. This is from one of the park areas in Lexington. They're street trees. Any of you have ever been on Massachusetts Avenue in Lexington know these two scenes at the top. And I guess a few years back, there was a major restructuring of the hardscape in center of Lexington, which looks very attractive. And then there are parks, and here are just two pictures from Lexington parks. As you can see, particularly the one on the right, there's some fairly large trees in there. And I'll talk about large trees and smaller trees as this progresses. And then this is my favorite part of trees in Lexington, which is the Minuteman Commuter Bikeway. And I love this picture because it shows cyclists properly riding with masks on, which is a recent development, of course. And I actually have lived in Arlington for many years while I was teaching at Tufts. And one of my favorite things to do when I wanted to take a bike ride is to get on the bike path and ride out to Lexington all the way to Bedford, and usually to stop in Lexington Center for either a coffee or an ice cream, depending on the season. So I'll talk about Lexington tree and woodland values and their services. And I'll call them woodlands rather than forests because it suggests that these are smaller than a forested area and probably not as ecologically complex, but they still have many of the values of larger forests if they're managed in a particular way. And I think, most of us initially began to appreciate trees because they were nice. It was nice to have trees around. They're aesthetic, and they create various amenity values, shade, comfort, they're attractive. Unfortunately, back in the early part of the 20th century, many towns, I know Arlington did this, and I suspect that Lexington did too, planted a lot of street trees that were Norway maples. Many of those are dying now, about 100 years later, 75 to 100 years later. And they've not really provided much functionality other than that they are green in the summer, and they don't even have that great of foliage in the fall. I suppose a few birds and squirrels nest in them, but they really don't have much ecological functional value. The trees, of course, they're important for recreational values. If you look at go on the Lexington town site, there are a number of park areas and forested areas, and people obviously enjoy these. It's well known that tree-lined streets increase property values, and I don't know if Lexington property values need to be increased more than they already are, but maybe one of the reasons they're that high is because there are nice tree-lined streets. Again, something I don't think affects Lexington very much, but in cities, when you correct for absolutely everything, income levels, everything, it turns out that neighborhoods that have trees have lower crime rates than neighborhoods that do not. And trees do, if you have a good mix of trees, they provide biological diversity and a whole range of natural values. There are many, I know because I see them out there, many people in Lexington who are bird watchers, and obviously birds need trees, most birds need trees in order to nest and so on. But there's actually more to biodiversity than just plants, birds, and mammals. There are the insects, of course. Many people plant butterfly gardens and so on, but there are literally thousands of insects that play important roles in keeping trees and forests and woodlands functioning. Trees actually clean the air. They absorb a number of air pollutants, and trees are one of our major suppliers of oxygen. As photosynthesis takes place and trees absorb carbon dioxide and suck up water, and with sunlight turn it into wood, they release oxygen. Every molecule of carbon dioxide that's absorbed releases one molecule of oxygen is released, and so we get over a quarter of our oxygen just from the trees on land. The rest comes from other plants on land and from plants in the ocean. Another unappreciated aspect of trees, we appreciate their shade in the summer. We know that cools things, but trees also cool by evaporation of water from their leaves, called evapotranspiration. And when the water evaporates from the leaves, it pulls water through the roots and up, bringing nutrients to the tree, and the water any water that it's lost, it replaces it. And that water that evaporates takes heat with it when it evaporates. And we'll see that's important for another reason in a moment, besides cooling. And tree roots, of course, prevent soil erosion. So there are a lot of valuable aspects to trees, aside from just the fact that most people like trees. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this aspect of trees, that climate mitigation through carbon accumulation. Since we have way too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we've added much more, beginning around the Industrial Revolution, although there were some additions before that when forests were cleared for agriculture in Europe and in Asia, and to some extent in the Americas. There was less fewer trees to absorb carbon dioxide, and the amount of carbon dioxide went up. And of course, as soon as we started burning fossil fuels, the combustion products are carbon dioxide and water, and then of course a lot of other pollutants that come with that. Trees, if we have more trees, we have more trees growing, we get climate mitigation, meaning that we reduce the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. Carbon, as one of my colleagues said, you have to remember that carbon that's stored in trees is carbon that's not carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's it's a trivial statement, but it's profoundly true. And so trees continue to accumulate carbon over time. And then trees also provide resiliency to a changed climate, especially flood reduction. And I'll explain why that happens. So for example, trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. About half of the carbon, about half of the wood in trees is carbon by weight. This is an actual very careful calculation that was carried out by Bob Leverett on a pretty good sized oak tree, red oak tree, that was 7.7 feet in circumference and 110 feet tall. And after he calculated the volume, he and I calculated what the carbon in it is, and it's storing 4.6 tons of carbon, a single tree. And in Lexington, there's something called the Mulliken oak, which is enormous. It's a lot more than 7.7 feet around, and it must be storing 2 or 3 times that amount of carbon. It's really a big store of carbon. Trees this size are rare because few of them are allowed to grow that large before they were harvested for either wood or fuel throughout the 400-year history of Massachusetts. And so this is really quite extraordinary. And one of the issues that I'll talk about in a moment is the conflict that arises when it's decided that something needs to be done in this space, and we're going to have to cut down a tree like this. And that usually generates a huge backlash from the citizenry. Just to do a comparison, there's a lot of talk about how small trees store more carbon or store it more rapidly than large trees. An issue came up in Northampton. This large tulip poplar on the left they were going to remove it because they were going to put some kind of development here. And the citizenry got pretty upset about this. This happens to be 7.7 feet in circumference and 140 feet high. And they were going to say, well, don't worry, we'll replace it with some trees. Here is the picture of the trees. They were going to plant several of these trees, which are 4 inches in circumference and 12 feet high. Oops, sorry for the typo there. Well, how many of these trees would you have to be equal to the amount of carbon that's in the one tree, the one big tree? And Bob Leverett has done this amazing calculation. He was very involved with this, with the Northampton town, the Northampton city officials and the citizenry, and he came up with this number. You need 11,733 of these little trees to have the same amount of carbon as this big tree. And even if you look at the annual growth, I don't know how old this tulip tree is, but it's probably, it's well over 100 years old. And so then people change and they say, well, small trees absorb carbon more rapidly than big trees. Well, indeed, this tree will double in size in the 7th year, and that's really fast. And this other tree, this big tree, will grow about 1.5% in that year. But the difference is that this tree will be absorbing about 2 to 3 times as much carbon in that year as this little one will. So it's important. You know, the lesson here is if you're concerned about storing carbon and accumulating carbon and removing carbon from the atmosphere, big trees are hugely important. And there's a lot of background to this. If you look at studies that have been done on forests, this study by Professor Erb in Germany concluded a couple of years ago that existing forests and grasslands can store twice as much atmospheric carbon as they currently do if we manage them differently. In other words, if we allow them to keep growing rather than constantly harvesting and reharvesting our forests. And back in 2011, Keaton, who's at the University of Vermont, concluded that New England forests can store between 2.4 and 4.3 times the current amounts in particular locations. It's just, there's a lot of unrealized additional storage capacity in New England forests, and by extension, even by individual New England trees. And this is just a statement from Bev Law, who's a prominent forest ecologist. Carbon in forests and soils is carbon not in the atmosphere. And that reminds me, incidentally, the older the forest is, the more carbon is stored in the soils. And in an older forest, if you look at the amount of carbon per acre, there is as much or more in the soils as there is in the trees. That basically comes from the, if you like, the decomposition or the composting of the fallen leaves and small and branches and things over the long years. Sort of the frosting on the cake on these studies is the study by Lutz and his colleagues. There are about 50 of them on this paper, including a scientist from Harvard Forest. They looked at 48 forests around the world, all different types, and they concluded that the largest 1% of trees in mature and older forests comprised 50% of forest biomass worldwide. That's a direct quote from the article. What that means is that out of every 100 trees in a mixed age mature forest, half of the carbon is in the biggest one. That's pretty amazing. And so that again tells us something when you're talking about isolated trees in a town setting, what kind of trees you'd like to have if you want to store carbon. This led to Ed Faison, who's a forest ecologist at Highstead in Connecticut, which is an affiliate of the Harvard Forest. and Susan Massino, who's at Trinity College, to publish a paper in 2019 in June, where we put all this information together and realized that everyone was talking about planting trees. And planting trees is great, but letting them grow is better if you want to store carbon. And we realized there were terms like obviously deforestation, but then there was a term like reforestation, which is replacing a forest, or at least the trees in a forest that has been recently cut down. And there's afforestation, which means planting trees somewhere where they haven't grown for a long time or maybe never grown. But there was no single word for letting existing trees grow. And so we coined the term proforestation, and that's actually now become an official term in Europe and at the International Union of Conservation of Nature and a whole bunch of other things. And what you can see is those two little red arrows there. The one on the right points to a skinny tree. The one on the left points to a big tree. And for scale, there's Bob Leverett, who measures big trees. So we define proforestation as growing forests to reach their ecological potential for carbon accumulation in wood and soils in the absence of human interference to meet that goal. And so that's the idea behind proforestation. This paper has gotten a lot of attention. The last time I looked, it's been viewed over 32,000 times in the top 99% of attention. And secondly, it's argued, well, but at some level, younger trees accumulate faster than older trees, and that is true. But if you cut down older trees and plant younger, faster growing trees, they will not surpass the growing carbon accumulation of slower growing larger trees, because those little trees have to get to the level of the big tree before they store as much as the big tree does. And the second thing is, when you plant trees, there's huge mortality, often as high as 80%. Even when you do reforestation in a controlled manner, the mortality rate can be 50%. I'm trying to plant a part of a meadow that's kind of surrounded by forest and putting trees in and so forth. And I can tell you the mortality rate is high. It's hard to keep them going when you first put them in. And it's also the case that proforestation stores more carbon than managed forests do. And often you'll hear from a forester, oh, you need to cut this forest to manage it to improve the stand. And what they really mean by that is to improve the stand for timber production. And so here are some data going back to 2010 showing different ways of managing forests. On the left, a clear cut, and the light color represents the amount of carbon that's stored in the products that come from that. And you can see it's only about half of the wood, and I'll show you why in just a moment. And all these different ways, and you get over here near the right, and that's called individual tree selection, the two on the right, and you don't really get a whole lot stored. And then the very one on the far right is a no management forest, and there's none of it stored in products, and there is more carbon stored in the living forest, the bottom long piece, and the other two are the standing dead trees, and then the coarse woody debris, the down dead trees in the forest. So they store a lot of carbon as well. So in the case of a town like Lexington, there are potential conflicts between trees and other values. I mentioned the case of the tulip tree in Northampton. I was contacted about a year ago by two groups in Newton who, one group wanted to, Newton is, by the way, has done a fantastic job of installing solar energy in the town. They covered their landfill first thing. They've put solar panels on the top of all kinds of buildings, and they were planning on covering parking lots and putting them in other places. But in order to do so, there was a problem, because this is sort of an engineering drawing showing, okay, if you have solar panels and you have trees, at some point, if you think of the sun moving across, let's say, let's say from left to right across these two trees. In the morning, the tree on the left is going to shade those panels, and in the later afternoon, the tree on the right will shade the panels. And one of the problems with solar panels is if you have an array and they're all on the same inverter that converts DC to AC current, shade on even a single panel will degrade the entire performance of the entire array. That can be dealt with technologically by having so-called microinverters on the back of each panel, so that the only one that's degraded is the one that's shaded. Anyway, so this is an issue. And so in Newton, they were going to cut down a bunch of very large trees so they could put in a cover over a parking lot and put solar panels on it. And I got calls from both groups because I have spent 20 years working on technological solutions like solar panels, and have I'm in my 14th year of living in a super insulated house that is net zero because of its solar panels. And so I believe in solar panels, and I committed to more solar panels, and we absolutely must have more solar panels to have more zero carbon energy. But we also need trees to be absorbing carbon, and trees have all these other values to people. And so what I realized was, at least in one of these cases, you could either take out about 4 or 5 trees, or you could just have just a half a dozen fewer panels that wouldn't get shaded. I don't know. I don't know how they finally resolved everything, but it is a challenge that we're facing, and I'll show you one we're facing out here in Western Massachusetts right now that's even more serious than that. Also, sometimes it's necessary to remove trees for safety. A tree that is failing or would cause serious damage if it were to blow over needs to be removed to protect property and people. And it's always a sad moment when a big old tree has to come down, but occasionally that has to happen. But it should be a last resort. I mean, if there's anything that can be done to save it, to shore it up, to treat it, whatever, should come first if you want to keep your trees, because it takes a long time, as you know. As a friend of mine said, you can't grow a 100-year-old tree in 10 years. You've got to be patient. And then people who want to have sun for their gardens, cut trees, or they want to have a sunny area for a lawn, whatever the reasons, they want to have sun there. And then there's cutting trees for solar arrays. And I've told the Newton story, but let me tell you the story in Western Massachusetts. This is not far from our place in Williamstown, in North Adams. And as you come over the Mohawk Trail, headed for the famous hairpin turn, you come to a point and you now look down on this area, which has been cut and solar panels installed. The photo on the left was while they were still installing the panels, and the photo on the right is from Google Earth. And so a group out here decided to study what was happening, and because of the way the state sets up its regulations, maybe Bob O'Connor can clarify some of this, there's a big incentive for people to cut down a chunk of forest and put in solar panels. They can make a lot more money that way, and they make some money from selling the lumber, the trees for lumber as well. So as of just over a year ago, there were 33 solar panel installations in Berkshire County, and 17 of them required clearing forests. That's more than half. And so this group that did the analysis of the area, with Google Earth, there are tools you can use to measure areas. And what they discovered was that the area covered by the panels is 9 acres, but the area cleared was 27 acres, or 3 times that area. And so some people said, well, you know, they took the area of the panels, 9 acres, and they said, well, yeah, but solar panels will produce this much zero net energy, and trees will only, on 9 acres, will only absorb that amount of electricity, and therefore this, or that amount of of carbon from the atmosphere, and so therefore it's okay. It should not be an either or. It should be a both and. That is, we put solar panels somewhere, and then we let trees grow and absorb carbon, and we get an added benefit. And ironically, there was a nearby strip mall just a few miles from this site that had been demolished years ago. There's nothing there but grass growing through the asphalt that is probably, which has got to be larger than 9 acres. That would have been a perfect place to put this. And then we would have had the absorption of carbon by the remaining trees over those years that they're now lost, and we would have had the solar production. So working out those things is not trivial, but it can be done. Okay. And what this has done is it's created NIMBY opposition to solar installations in Western Massachusetts. And that's really a bad thing. It's getting to be as bad as the opposition to wind turbines, of which we also have quite a few. Not quite a few, we have a couple of dozen, I guess, that I know of in Berkshire County. But the opposition to the solar panels, which then gets transferred to all solar panels, is growing out here, and that's not a healthy situation. So basically the message is protect large trees and trees that will become big over the coming decades. So this is actually a photo supposedly from Lexington. I'm not quite sure which of the woods it is. Lots of very young trees. This was clearly an open area as recently as probably 20 years ago. But there are a couple, you can see on the right, a couple of larger trees. And it'll take a very long time for these small trees to amount to very much, but those kind of middle-sized trees on the right they're poised to really begin packing on the carbon in a big way over the next 30 years, which is the time period we need to be absorbing carbon. So that's my presentation. And I will stop there and ask for questions.
Thank you so much. I see no questions yet on the Q&A. So while we're waiting for any, I would like to ask my own.
Sure.
Professor Moomaw, you said that you showed that chart showing that the no management option was the best, if I can read charts correctly, at
Yes.
preserving carbon.
That's correct.
So what do we say when President Trump says, you've got to clean up those forests, you got to get out there and rake the bottoms? How does that comport with wildfire management?
Well, it does not comport well. The thing about wildfire management, I'm actually working with four forest fire management experts out in the West on some research on this and other things. And the thing is that, first of all, building out there in fire-prone areas is equivalent to what we do here in the East of allowing the building in floodplains, right? And in both cases, climate change is changing the conditions so that people who build in what used to not be a floodplain but now is a floodplain because of the increased precipitation from global warming are actually they're going to suffer flooding, and so we really shouldn't be building those places. Similarly, in the West, people should not be building in those fire zones. But you could protect those by clearing an area about 100 feet around the buildings. That's all the clearing that will make a difference for protecting property. And the studies show that if you just go out somewhere and thin to prevent fires, that the chance that a fire will occur in that place is only less than 1%. So and the other thing is, I always thought thinning meant you took out the little trees. No. The forestry industry takes that as a signal to go out and cut the big trees, which leaves the little trees. And guess which trees burn the fastest? The little trees. So the hottest fires are in the areas that have been logged and the areas that have been thinned. And by the way, raking leaves is not going to solve the problem. It's just not.
Thank you. We've now got a whole passel of questions. We're not going to get through them all. Just going in order, the first question was wondering if evergreens sequester as much carbon as deciduous.
Good question. The answer is for the same diameter. By the way, it's diameter that really is important, because diameter determines the volume as the square of the diameter, whereas the height is only linear. I did an exercise with my grandkids where they went out and measured trees, and then we used Bob Leverett's formulations to figure out the amount of carbon in them. And so the trees, one was twice as, there were two white pine trees. They were twice as tall as, one was twice as tall as the other. One of them was 4.3 feet in circumference, and the other one was about 1.25 feet in circumference. The big tree holds 51 times as much carbon as the small one. Because even though it's twice as tall, the volume is only 1/50th of the other tree, because the diameter is so much smaller.
And just to be clear, when we talk about diameter, we're talking about diameter at breast height.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Of the trunk.
Of the trunk.
Should we be protecting Norway maples?
Well, I'm not a great fan of Norway maples personally. I guess that's a matter of personal. I mean, if they're still healthy and so on, sure, they're providing shade, they're evaporating water and cooling. But I know, I mean, in Arlington, I had one large maple fall, fortunately, between the house I had there and the one next door, and then another one was so rotted on the inside that it was dropping branches on cars and things and had to be taken down. So. They're at an age where they need to be replaced, and I'll be interested to hear from your tree warden about what his thinking is about Norway maples. I mean, he knows more about those details than I do.
So what I'm going to actually have to do now is move on. We have this wonderful set of additional questions, but we'll save them for you. And if you'd be willing to give us some answers, we could email them later. Is that okay? You're on mute. You've muted yourself.
I'll take a look in the chat box and just see what they are.
Yeah, it's in the Q&A box. Thank you. All right, I'd like to turn now to Charlie Wyman to introduce our next speaker.
All right. Hi. I'm Charlie Wyman. I'm also, like Rick, a member of Sustainable Lexington, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Bob O'Connor. Bob is the Director of the Division of Conservation Services for the State Environmental Agencies of the Commonwealth. He has a BS in Forestry and 2 master's degrees, one in Business Administration and the other in Conflict Resolution and Mediation. He has served as Director of the Watershed Initiative and as Superintendent of Quabbin Reservoir, and has for many years coordinated land and conservation efforts in and for the Commonwealth. I've known Bob for more than 2 decades, and he has a well-deserved reputation for being one of the smartest, most dedicated, and frankly, nicest people in the state's environmental agency. Bob, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Charlie. And thank you to the Sustainability Committee and the Tree Committee and the Cary Library for having Bill and I speak tonight. So I'm gonna share my screen here, hopefully. And like Bill, I found some photos on the web of Lexington, but I found it interesting that a lot of the beautiful treed yards that you find on the web are on real estate websites that are showing how nice it would be to live in a house like this. Trees definitely enhance the value of homes and make it a nicer place to live for everybody. So I'm going to go in a kind of a similar path that Bill did, but a little bit more urban and suburban in the focus on trees. And I'm going to start by talking about a program we have at the Department of Conservation and Recreation and the Environmental Affairs Office where I work. It's about 5 years old, and it's called Greening the Gateway Cities. And we have 24 cities in Massachusetts that are classified as gateway cities. They meet certain criteria for poverty and kind of low income, and are the focus of a lot of our environmental justice neighborhoods in the state. And I'll talk about environmental justice in a minute too. So as I'll show you here, this program started in 2014. It was piloted in Fall River, Holyoke, and Chelsea. This tree is on one of the main streets in Chelsea. And it focuses on hiring local crews to plant trees. And about 80% of the trees that we plant, we focus on the most untreed neighborhoods in these cities. And the areas with the most poverty are always almost an exact overlay of low canopy. So there's a very strong correlation between low income minority neighborhoods and low canopy. So we focus on planting in yards because it's nice to plant trees on the street like this street tree right here, but street trees are suffering from being pot bound because there's usually not enough space for the roots to grow, so they're kind of challenged. But we need to plant street trees, but we focus in the yards, and we enlist the residents to water and take care of the trees for the first 2 years, where the trees will have a really good chance to continue to grow. We enlist a local nonprofit to work with in each city we work in, and we expanded by 4 new cities this summer. So we're now planting trees in 18 cities. And so far we planted 27,000 trees that are like this tree right here. So, whoops. So I'm going to go through a similar kind of list of the value of trees that that Bill did, and starting with I think trees bring nature close to people. That's a really important. One of my criteria for where I wash the dishes every night is I want to have a nice tree to look at while I'm washing the dishes. So I think it goes beyond that. We've had studies where people recovered from surgery with a beautiful view out of the window at trees, and others without that view, and the people recovered more quickly who had the view of trees. It's a calming influence on people, and it really kind of lowers your blood pressure and relaxes people to look at nature and trees. So it saves neighborhoods on heating and cooling, which is also helping us reduce carbon emissions. It reduced the urban heat island, which really is going to be the probably most significant impact of climate change, causing the most health issues of any of the climate change impacts. Reduces stormwater and flooding to have more trees, improves air quality and health, increases property values and then therefore tax base, improves the beauty of the neighborhood, and stores more carbon in the community. So we've done 2 surveys with a group of interns from local colleges of the people who are caring for these 27,000 trees in the 18 cities. And really what they love the most about the trees is the beauty, how it makes the neighborhoods more beautiful. So the first value is bringing trees near people is always a good thing. It's often people's first contact with nature, and it's a gateway to other conservation. You know, there's most of the residents of Massachusetts do live in urban environments, and they're really going to be the future stewards of our natural environment. So connecting people with nature is more and more important, especially as climate impacts continue to increase. So we know the location on a GIS computer map of every one of the 27,000 trees. So I asked our GIS analysts to draw a 50-foot circle around every tree where these trees are going to have an impact as they grow up. And lo and behold, there's at first there looked like there was 5 residents who lived within 50 feet of each of the trees in Chelsea. But the more trees we planted, that ratio went down, but it's held at more than 1 person is living, you know, by the census data within 50 feet of each tree. So each tree we plant, we're really connecting 1 person to nature. So the next value is heating and cooling value of trees. And we kept kind of looking at modeling that showed this as we began the, tried to begin the Greening the Gateway City program in 2013. And right around that time, around 2010, there was a terrible disaster in Worcester with the Asian longhorn beetle, an invasive species that attacks a lot of our deciduous trees, especially the Norway maple, which we, as Bill mentioned, we have a lot of. So in one neighborhood that was kind of ground zero for the Asian longhorn beetle in the Greendale neighborhood of kind of North Worcester, they had to, over the winter of 2009 and 10, remove almost every tree in this neighborhood. So you can see, this is a map of the canopy before and after they removed all the trees that were either infected or susceptible to the Asian longhorn beetle, because it was really important to stop it from spreading into New England's forests, because it would really devastate the forests. So for the last 10 years, there's been a lot of people working on that, and they've been by and large successful. It's almost contained at this point. But we saw this as a natural experiment of whether trees actually do save energy. So we were able to hire a graduate student from UMass Amherst who did her thesis on this project. There's about 700 homes in this region. And in one winter, they lost all their trees. And I'll show you some photos in a second. But they balanced the degree days of the summer of 2009 and the summer of 2010, and were able to show that the electricity usage went up by 40% in 1 year. And coincidentally, here's the neighborhood, an aerial view from a year or two before they cut the trees down. And here it is afterwards. It's almost like a bunch of 1950 Cape houses. They're suddenly in a farm field. So this is what it looked like on the ground before. A lot of these streets were like a tunnel of trees, and then afterwards, nothing. And people would even say that they couldn't find their house after they cut down all the trees because it just didn't seem like the same place to them anymore. It was like a different world. So one of the things that this disaster helped was it clearly showed that there was almost each 1% of canopy that covers the neighborhood reduces the energy by 1%. So 40% loss of canopy, 40% increase of energy. And it also piloted the method that we ended up using for planting at the Greening Gateway Cities program, which was hiring local crews. And this was during the Great Recession that there were a lot of unemployed people. And I always remember the mastermind behind this whole idea, who would bring the paychecks to his crew in Worcester every Friday. And literally they would give him a standing ovation every time he passed out the checks because they were so glad to have a meaningful job like this. And so this is about 4 years later that this neighborhood was replanted, and it's starting to look better. And we're trying to replicate that experiment now with getting the energy data to show that we're starting to see reductions in the energy use. We didn't really have a good study for the winter benefits of trees, and a lot of people thought, well, once the leaves fall off, how could trees do much for helping your house to stay warm? But actually, the canopy, even without its leaves, causes the wind to be deflected around your house. And there was a great study done in a small city in Minnesota where it's very cold. A lot of the tree studies for energy are done in warmer climates, like in California and Arizona. But this was the first study we saw that looked at a cold climate city. And they found the same thing. They didn't cut down, the trees weren't all cut down, but they basically looked at the energy use of every house in a neighborhood with several hundred houses. And then they looked at the canopy around every house. And it turned out that the most significant impact on your winter energy use was how much canopy was in like 500 or 1,000 feet around your house. So this is one of those circles around one of those houses that made this very strong correlation. And again, it was about 1% more canopy around your house 1% less heating and 1% less cooling also. They showed the same thing that we found. So as climate change continues to build, as Bill can certainly tell you, we're predicted to have, and we now have an average of about 7 days over 90 degrees each summer. That's going to go up all the way to about 77 days, which basically is the whole summer. So the heat island effect, which magnifies the heating in urban and downtown areas where there's a lot of pavement, it basically is causing an exaggerated warming. And this is kind of a graph of how much warmer it is in cities and towns than it is in the countryside. And increasing the canopy can basically cut off the peak of that peak load. And that's good for the people that live in that city, because when it gets above 90, then there's a lot more ground level ozone, which aggravates asthma and a lot of respiratory ailments that people have. There's been studies, as I'll show in a minute, that in New York and the United Kingdom that relate health center catchment areas to asthma hospitalizations. And there's a direct correlation, again, between the amount of canopy coverage in your area where you live and how much hospitalizations there are. So the other benefit of cutting off that peak is that the peak energy load is the dirtiest, most challenging load of energy that we have. This is where they turn on the diesel generators so that we don't lose our power during the heat waves. But when you think about it, one of the biggest challenges to reach our no net carbon emissions by 2050 goal that we have is decarbonizing the whole electric grid. So in doing that, the one thing we don't need is a big peak for 77 days over the summer when we're trying to balance issues like Bill brought up with where do we put the solar and how do we put in wind turbines and keep everybody happy and protect our environment. So the first 3 cities we planted in, we installed hundreds of these automatic temperature sensors all throughout the neighborhoods of Fall River, Holyoke, and Chelsea. And they noted the canopy coverage over each one of these. And right off the bat, you can see that there's a direct correlation with the hottest days getting cooler under the trees, which is just common sense. When you go out on a hot day, you want to go on the shady side of the street. So getting into the stormwater impacts, this is from DEP, our Department of Environmental Protection, and there's kind of an irony of development. First, we cut down all the trees and pave it, which causes more heat island and flooding. And then we cut down more trees so we can handle the stormwater. So something's wrong with this picture. And actually, one 12-inch tree, and this is not the 7.5 foot round tree that Bill was talking about, it's just kind of a smaller than average tree. Each time it rains, the leaf area of a tree is just tremendous. There's more surface area in a tree than you can imagine. And the first quarter or half an inch, and I was out with my family walking, as the only thing we can all do these days, and we got caught in a very rare thunderstorm this summer. And where do we go but stand under a tree? And you can see like how long you're dry. The first quarter or half an inch of a thunderstorm, you're dry, then the tree is saturated. But in that saturation, and then after the storm, all that water evaporates, so it's not part of the flooding and storm water. Just that one tree can hold over a year 1,353 gallons, and down at the bottom of this slide are 2 tanks that equal that amount of water. So it's actually almost 10% of the storm water that's in the vicinity of this tree is reduced. So that's a huge thing. So, you know, there's more and more use of using trees to help filter the water and reduce the storm. This is a tree filter on the left and a rain garden with some trees in it on the right. It's called green infrastructure. This is the kind of parking lot we'd like to see with a lot of trees in it, because parking lots cause a lot of runoff, and you know, we need to reduce the parking, but we also need to reduce the runoff. We had a project with EPA down in Fall River where we're planting trees, and treating stormwater so that it's not the main source of pollution is a big challenge for cities. And Fall River spent $100 million on this 13-foot in diameter tunnel, 300 feet below the city. And the purpose of that tunnel is when there's a big rainstorm, the water goes into the tunnel and just waits for the treatment to catch up. So there's some neighborhoods that the water doesn't flow to the tunnel. And this was the case with where we were planting the trees. So we actually hired through a grant, Tetra Tech, to design 12 tree filters throughout the neighborhood. And you can see each one has a little watershed that drains to it. You don't want to overwhelm the tree filter. But these tree filters will have the impact of removing 1,200 square feet of pavement, which is like a quarter of an acre of pavement, just through these tree filters. So here's where one of these tree filters is going to go. It's got to go near where the drain goes into the storm sewer. And you have to kind of do a lot of work around the pavement to put it in. And this is what it looks like. Each one reduces the equivalent of a paved area of 32 by 32 feet, which is pretty amazing. So one other tool that you may be interested in is called a stormwater utility. There's a handful of communities in Massachusetts that have them, and it basically just charges businesses and residents a small amount depending upon how much pavement and impervious surface they have, meaning how much they contribute to the stormwater. So the more you have, the more you have to pay. And there's been several cities around the country that have used trees as a way to reduce your payment. So in other words, if you have a certain amount of payment and you pay $100 in your fee, if you planted a few trees around, especially around your driveway or other paved areas, you can get a reduction on that because you're really reducing stormwater. So it's kind of a win-win for adding green to the city and town and reducing stormwater and getting a benefit. We've been working on a project that I'll talk about in a minute, but one of the big recommendations has been to help the DPW departments, who are the tree wardens, as you'll hear about in a minute, for all of our cities and towns. They want to do green infrastructure, planting trees, putting in rain gardens, but they need more help to do that. So the idea of a green infrastructure DPW division is kind of a added division is something that's been talked about. So now we're getting into how trees can improve health. And I mentioned they can, cool the neighborhood to reduce asthma. They clean the air, they clean a lot of particulates. They also, having a green neighborhood promotes exercise. We're currently doing a survey of the people that got trees in our gateway cities, and we're asking them all about how they like the trees, how could we, and we get 100% enthusiasm for this out of 200 people we've talked to. But we're also asking them where they walk during the COVID epidemic and, what is their walking experience in their neighborhood in Leominster or Lynn or some of the Lawrence or Lowell, and how could that experience be improved? So exercise goes along with nature and trees as does mental health and stress. This is a grant we got for the small towns of Southbridge and Ware from the Forest Service to plant trees for public health in partnership with 2 community hospitals. And this was the first tree they planted just before the pandemic. So I'm not going to get into this slide too much, but it talks about all the different studies that have shown how trees can help health. And there's actually a great study in Louisville, Kentucky, where they've planted a wide strip of trees and shrubs to buffer an elementary school from a very busy highway. And they're already seeing like improved health indices of the students from having that buffer behind the filter. But when you talk about environmental justice, this is a picture here of the Snug Harbor public housing neighborhood in Quincy, and it's probably one of the largest public housing neighborhoods in the Commonwealth. And I'm going to show you all the trees that we planted there. But this picture, I started counting the smokestacks that are within, a stone's throw of this house, and I counted 7. And that's really what environmental justice is really all about, is equaling the impact, the negative impacts, and equaling the positive impacts of nature. So this is where we planted 700 trees. And immediately after we planted these trees, we saw people hung bird feeders, people built benches under them. They're just trees. Planting trees is like planting hope, and it's a positive thing. These are just some of the quotes from people that have received our trees. You know, we were asking them, is it, you know, are you hoping it's going to save you energy and things like that, because that's where our funding comes from. But what they were saying was it's just improved their lives. I literally, one of the phone calls our intern did, the person said, it's very interesting you called, because I just came back from taking pictures of my neighbor's trees when you called. People just love trees, and so that's part of it. But I've talked about the peak load, the employment benefits, you know, the new green economy could be jump-started with trees, crews planting trees and caring for trees, planting the right tree in the right place so we don't replicate that mistake that we made planting all those Norway maples. We plant no more than 3 or 4% of any one species, and we plant about 50 different species. That's our palette that we offer people when we go to show them, do they want a tree? One of the other benefits of having programs like this is you're bringing public health, community gardens, affordable housing, a lot of different partners into the conservation field. And these are all the nonprofits we work with in the Gateway City program. And not only is it the most diverse meeting that I go to each year, because the environmental workforce is not very diverse, but there's a lot of groups that really didn't have the environment as their goal, but they've adopted that as one of their goals in addition to the other good things that they do. So there's a lot of studies that show property values increase with trees. And that is a double-edged sword, because, you know, towns would like to get more revenue by having a greener community, but higher housing costs is an issue, and you know, driving people out with higher rents is a big issue as well. So I mentioned the stormwater tree credit, but there is a new program called City Forest Credits, and you can just type that into the internet to get it. But it's a new carbon credit program specially made for urban and community tree planting. And one of the things that it makes it more amenable to a carbon credit, as Bill said, this little tree is not going to be, you know, putting on a ton of carbon every year. But it will have a lot of benefits until it gets to that point where it is doing that. But this program pays you in the early years of the tree planting. Once it's been established, after 3 or 4 or 5 years, a tree is likely to survive. And we have a program from Clark every summer where students go to different cities where we planted trees, and they've measured over 2,500 of our 27,000 trees. And we can pretty firmly say that we have about an 88% survival of our trees, rather than the 80% loss that Bill mentioned, because we are very careful about how we plant the trees. There's a skill to planting trees the right way, and I'm thrilled to see that Lexington has a tree planting and retention guidebook, which is really important. So this morning I went out to get out of the house and took a picture of my yard in Needham, where we don't have a tree protection ordinance like Lexington does. I planted these 2 trees in the front of the yard about 20 years ago. And you can see trees do grow. And these trees really do provide a lot of shade in the morning and in the evening for my house, and do reduce the need to cool it, definitely. So what are the threats to suburban tree cover? This top right picture I took on the Needham-Wellesley border, where there was a large estate that is now being turned into a lot of housing. And generally when a development occurs without any guidance or bylaws like Lexington has, every tree is removed, and worse yet, all the soil is scraped up and piled in the back. And soil is a living ecosystem with hundreds and thousands of different animals living in it that make it productive and produce the carbon that Bill talked about. That's basically killed by piling it up here. So you're basically pushing dead soil back over, and you're erasing, you know, what can be centuries of accumulation of carbon in the soil when you do, you know, and I know that Lexington is struggling with the whole tear down phenomenon, which is pictured here, and it's probably one of the greatest threats to the trees and why you have a great tree protection ordinance. So I read through a lot of tree protection bylaws. I started with the Lexington one, which is a great one. And then, you know, other communities, it's something about the Minuteman Trail, Lexington, Arlington, Concord, Wellesley, and Newton all have really good, outstanding plans. Newton is one that was just done in 2020, so it's a good one to look at. But they have several common elements. They look at what threats are there to the trees and have a plan that includes all the stakeholders. So there's people with all kinds of opinions about trees, and you want to include them, and I'm sure you are. And you want to have tree protection zones that are workable and effective. When I look at my yard, I have 6 nice trees in my yard, 10,000 square foot, quarter of an acre or less. And with your tree protection zone, 5 of those 6 trees would be protected, which I'm, I wish I could move my yard to Lexington. So you want to have protection as the first line of defense, and then you know, planting and payment as options that are used only when they're needed. You want to protect the trees and the soil, and you want to have guidelines that are followed, which again, Lexington has that. And you want to have the forest remain intact. So we're doing a soil plan for Massachusetts. It's just about done, and that's where I'm learning all about, you know, how valuable the soil is for climate, really. We have 400,000 acres of lawns in Massachusetts. We didn't know that until we did this project. And we really only have 200,000 acres of farm fields. So there's a lot of room to plant more trees in a lot of communities. And another project that I mentioned earlier, as I wrap up here, is the Resilient Lands Initiative, which is really a conservation plan, land conservation plan for Massachusetts. And our goal, that was the most popular goal of all the meetings we had, was to have a no net loss of farms and forests. And that can be achieved through smart growth, natural resource protection zoning, shrinking the footprint, that you know, having more compact development, and then replicating the loss in communities and cities through new green space. It's kind of an environmental justice and a kind of rural-urban connection, working with suburbs. So I wanted to finish with this photo of the Claiborne neighborhood of Fitchburg, where I had done some work early in my career. We created a park that was on the site of a burned out mill. And then we gave a grant to protect the hillside that connects. You literally can walk from this neighborhood to New Hampshire in the woods through the Fitchburg water supply. And now we're just launching a tree planting program in this neighborhood. So a great quote that I heard along my travels was from the Kennebuck, Maine Land Trust. We used our community to protect land. Now we need to use the land to support the community. So you need to connect the land to the values that people have. And I love this quote. Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. So that's about it. I'm hoping that, you know, that tree planting and retention, and Bill kind of covered the natural areas, which you have 2,000 acres of, which is really incredible that a small town like Lexington has so much protected open space. And you know, letting the trees grow in those areas is certainly a good idea. So
Thank you so much, Robert. I'm going to just say that we ought to skip questions right now and hold them till the end, so that we can give a little time to DPW Chief Dave Pinsino and Tree Warden Chris Philidoro. And if you guys would leave us 10 minutes at the end, we have a hard stop at 8:45. So that would be helpful. Thank you so much so far. Dave.
Yeah, we'll be quick. Thank you for having us, and those are very good presentations. A lot of good information that's out there. I'll just give you a little bit of background on some of the things that we're doing here in Lexington. The tree planting program, we've had a pretty strong program even before 2000 when I started with the town, where our goal is to plant 140 trees per year, 70 in the spring and 70 in the fall, and really in a number of different locations. We really try to get right tree in the right place. We've worked with the tree committee to come up with a tree planting guideline to help us get trees out into the community. And we're planting trees in the town rights of way. We're planting in park areas. We're planting, in playground areas around public ground spaces. But we also have a very successful setback tree planting program. And I wanted to highlight that. It's where people can request a tree that we plant not in the town right of way. We go into a property about 20 feet and we go ahead and plant a tree. We warranty and maintain it for a year, and then it becomes the property owner's responsibility. But it's been a very good way, both for people to get trees and for us to get trees out into the landscape. So that's been a very good program for us. We do a lot now with bare root, and Chris can touch on that a little bit in a minute. We did try our hand at a tree nursery, which we're reevaluating. We had some success with that, but that does take quite a bit of effort, both time and materials to do. I'll touch on, you mentioned the tree bylaw. So the tree bylaw was adopted in October of 2001, basically regulating trees on a property that have new construction or a 50% or greater addition to existing buildings. Regulates a zone that's 30 feet to the front of into the front of the property, 15 feet on the two sides and the rear. So we took a more proactive approach than just the regular zoning setbacks. And it's any trees that are 6 inches or greater in that zone have to be evaluated by the tree warden. They're not just able to be removed, although some are removed for a number of reasons, be it where the utilities have to go, things of that nature, or they are hazard trees. But really working and having builders look at a property. Prior to that, builders would just come in and clear cut a whole lot without any thought to leaving trees, what the site would look like afterwards. So this has been, I think, a good effort to have something in place that helps to protect some of those trees, while still also looking at private property rights for the interior of the property. So with that, if the trees are removed and they are not a hazard, there is a replanting requirement. If trees cannot go back onto the site, then there's a payment amount that goes into the Lexington Tree Fund, which we can then use to plant trees in other areas of town. So the goal is to get trees back into the canopy, and knowing that they're not going to match what was there before, but I think, as you heard Robert speak, getting those trees back into the landscape certainly is important. So those are a couple of the things that we are doing. A couple of other initiatives that we have. We are going to be launching a tree canopy study. We're looking to put bids out for that in a couple of weeks. That's really going to give us a good snapshot as to what's happening in the town. You saw some of the pictures showing, a lot of tree cover in town, but we want to know what's there, what's the cover, and then be able to factor in the number of trees that are lost in any given year with the number of trees that are planted, and really come up with a goal for what we want to see in Lexington to really have a healthy canopy, which again, in turn, leads to healthy living. So that's a project that we're going to be working with the tree committee on to get that going. We are still in the process of completing our tree inventory. We have about 3 precincts left. That's going to be again bid out shortly. We hope to have that wrapped up in the next 6 months. And again, that's going to give us a kind of an idea as to what's out there, what condition, what areas can we replant in, where do we need to look at the health of the tree system in Lexington. So those are a couple of things that we have. And then I'll let Chris talk a little bit more about the planting program.
Thanks, Dave. Chris Filodero, Public Grounds Superintendent and Tree Warden for Lexington. Been there for almost 10 years now. Dave left a nice big shoe for me to fill, but he's been helping me out over the years. And so we do, a big part of my responsibility is the Lexington tree bylaw. It consumes a large part of our time, but I think we do a good job managing it, working with the builders. We spent a lot of time working with our tree committee, and they have helped us a lot over the last 15 to 20 years with that planting program. And as Dave alluded to, the setback planting, which has been a saving grace because it allows us to get those trees away from those power lines, set them back so that there's a dual benefit for a resident and the public to acknowledge the trees and have the nice curb appeal of them. So, and then we have about 7 years ago, we started going to more of a bare root program, looking at the costs, benefits, just the overall handling of the tree, the shipping of the tree, and not inheriting a poor or heavy clay soil on a bald and burlap tree if you don't have to. And I think we've had a much higher success rate of that. Before that, we did try very aggressively with a lot of volunteer work from the tree committee to have a tree farm. That was very good. It just didn't work out for us, unfortunately. We still do have hopes of working with a tree farm in the future, but as of right now, for production and to maintain those numbers of about 140 to 150 trees per year, the bare root program works much better. As Dave said, we're also putting out the RFQs currently for the planting. So we used to do a lot of planting in-house with our staff. We have a 5-man forestry staff. And then with working with the tree committee and town meeting for the budget, we were able to put more funding together and gathering money from the building the Lexington Tree Fund over the last 7 years. We have more money now to do that with contractors. And I think the success rate has been good. This year has been pretty challenging with the drought, but overall, I think we have a good program put together. I do just want to talk a minute about what a tree warden does, and what we do is it's tough to follow the guidelines of everything every day, but first and foremost, we try to mitigate all hazards and make sure everything's nice and safe. So there's many different avenues of what we do as a team. But first and foremost, we want to take care of the hazards. And then replanting falls right behind that, pretty much in a close second. And just another little shout out, we do have, out of our 5 staff members on forestry, 3 of them are certified arborists, and a 4th one is soon to be a mass certified arborist as well. And the education that we put towards those people is basically whatever they want to do. And they've taken full advantage of that, to the point where our foreman has been there for almost 30 years. He's a mass certified arborist. He's a tree risk assessment. I don't have all of his credentials here, but he was part of the strike force. He was asked to go down to Washington, D.C. and serve that strike force. And he was out in Springfield working with that whole Asian longhand beetle mess out there as well. So I really feel as though that the team that I inherited and helped put together with Dave's help, and I think a lot of people look towards Lexington to see what we're doing. We always look at other communities because we always want to grow our knowledge and build good relationships with other people, and part of the Mass Tree Wardens Association. And but I think I'm very proud to say that a lot of people come to Lexington and want to know what we're doing. We've been called by the Brooklines, the Wellesleys, the Newtons, to talk to us about our bylaw and what we're doing. So it's very nice that they are calling on us, and it's not us playing catch up and calling on them. But I think the working relationship we have with all those towns and the Mass Tree Wardens Association has been very, very good. And overall, I think it works great.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So one thing I did just want to mention real quick as well, that in at least town projects that are brought through from the Public Works, we try to implement tree plantings throughout those projects. We work closely with the Recreation Department on their projects. So, you know, if you've been out to the center playfield, you'll see newly planted trees out there. Some of the other projects that we've been involved in, when the streetscape project comes into being, there was a lot of thought given into trying to get proper tree pits, tree wells, aeration, irrigation, so that we would have a thriving tree population in the downtown area. So really looking at those types of things, working those into the construction mix, I think will be better for all. So Rick, that's kind of what we had in a nutshell. There's a lot of information online, and I'll just hold up. We do have the tree management manual, which that is online. If you go on the tree committee's website, a lot of good, useful information in that manual. So thank you.
Thank you both. And it's just been a great evening so far with too many questions to address. And I hope people will realize we're trying to just start a conversation here that we hope will continue. So before we move to the questions, I'd like to ask Jerry Paul, the chair of the tree committee, to say a few words.
Thank you. Let me just share a screen here. Here we go. And I knew Dave and Chris would do an excellent job, which they did, covering a lot of areas. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through my slides to leave time for questions. What is the Lexington Tree Committee? Why a Lexington Tree Committee and a tree bylaw? Well, it was sites like this back in the late 90s that Dave referred to that motivated the need to better protect our trees and spread the word about the benefits of trees and why we had to protect them. The tree committee, along with the bylaw, was established in 2001. The members are appointed by the select board. And the tree committee's objective is to preserve, maintain, and increase tree canopy as our contribution globally in terms of climate change and locally in terms of the quality of life in Lexington. And as Dave said, there's much more information on the tree committee page in the town website. What I would like to do, it's new, is talk about a new organization called Lexington Friends of Trees. It's an adjunct organization to the tree committee. There's a Facebook page on which I think we've put a lot of interesting content already, more to come. And you can also subscribe to the Lexington Friends of Trees email list. Just send an email. You don't have to have a special subject. Just send an email there and you'll be added to the list. So with that, I say thank you, and we can move on to the Q&A.
Fantastic. I think we could have had a lot more discussion from each one of our speakers, but we got a lot of questions. I'm just going to summarize a little bit here and ask our speakers to kick in as they feel inspired. So we had a number of questions about, should we be removing some things from our forests, from our woodlands? Should we be removing Norway maples because they prevent other more desirable trees from generating? Should we going after the vines, the bittersweet vines? Should we be removing small trees so that they let larger trees do better? Who wants to respond to that? Thank you.
I can give one response, which is, I mean, if a Norway maple is really healthy and it's storing carbon, it's providing some functionality. But as I said, a lot of these trees were planted pretty much at around the same time, within a few decades of each other. And so a lot of them are going to be, are already gone, and will be. And so it's really but it's also a question of values. I mean, some people like one kind of tree over another tree, so personal preference is going to play a role as well.
Yeah, I think we need to just, as Dave mentioned, the right tree in the right place. When you're replanting the trees, go for as much diversity as you can, because climate change is going to be sending a lot of Asian longhorn beetles type vectors at us. And, we already have the emerald ash borer. There's the Hemley woolly adelgid. There's, with warming climates, many more threats are coming. So the diversity is important.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right, Bob. I was delighted to hear you say you had what did you call it? A palette of 50 or 60 species.
That's the book that we show everybody, that they're thrilled.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I can just add on the Norway maples. We started out when we put the bylaw together as not wanting to protect them. And then what we found is that in the right spot, in the right setting, in the home landscape, they were actually a pretty valuable tree in the overall neighborhood. So we now protect them, although we don't promote planting them. And, certainly you have to monitor them to make sure they're not going to fail, things like that. But just recognizing that they do have a place, and they can provide a lot of value in the right spot. So we've kind of looked at that, but we don't plant them. We don't promote planting them. And if they fail, they come down and something else goes in its place. So
Now, what about male and female trees, which makes a difference? The male contribute to pollen, right?
I don't think there are.
The ginkgo tree is the one that comes to mind, which is, has a problem with it's hard to tell which are which in the nursery, and the female trees have, there's a lot. I know my daughter lived in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of ginkgos that they tend to smell really, really bad. But I think they've learned a lot about, not planting the ones that smell bad. But
what
most
about
are not like one, they have both male and female on the same tree.
So as an asthma prevention strategy, does it make sense not to plant more female trees?
I mean, there aren't a lot of just female trees.
Right.
I mean, most trees have both flowers on them, and so you're going to get the pollen no matter what. But I think ginkgos should be out anyway, because they're an Asian tree. It has nothing to do with North America. It is interesting because it's an ancient tree, but it's maybe as an ornamental species or something. But I certainly wouldn't plant them as street trees.
Well, there are some trees that have less pollen. So, I mean, there's like a list that we have, when we are in, we're also thinking about which trees are going to survive in a future climate. So we're increasingly planting trees that are more adapted to areas south of here, because they're going to be growing into that climate. But there are trees with less pollen. Asthma is partially caused by pollen, but there's a lot of other things, indoor air quality, and the really hot days are a real bad aggravator for asthma too. So.
Okay, thank you. Being from New York City, I have to just say the ginkgos are absolutely beautiful. They have just a beautiful leaf. So,
and they're very pretty yellow foliage in the fall.
Yeah. So another series of questions have come in about how we could have financial incentives for proforestation and disincentives for clearing trees where they shouldn't be cleared, incentives to encourage, planting in places like you talked about, that abandoned mall, and disincentives for taking down trees for ordinary development, which we see a lot. So what can we do about the financial incentives and disincentives?
Bob, you probably know more about Chapter 61 and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. So, I know Bill has a great slide of the carbon content of the New England forest. And you can see that Western Massachusetts is probably the most carbon rich area in New England. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a really shocking statistic, and Bill, you can check whether I'm heard it right, but Massachusetts has a larger net growth of its forest than Maine. So Maine, is, I don't know, many times larger than Massachusetts. And it's much more heavily forested. We have about a 60% forest cover in Massachusetts, which is incredible. We're, I think, the 8th or 9th state in that category. But Maine is number 1. They've got like 90% forest and a lot of it. But they really do a lot of intensive management, for pulp and paper, so the trees don't grow very old. So we're lucky to have an older forest than a lot of parts of New England. And I think we need to try to balance incentives for first keeping the forest as a forest. Don't let it get developed, because that's the worst thing we can do, because then you lose the soil carbon as well as the trees. And all the habitat value of trees as well. So, but then I think we need a kind of a range of forest reserves where we don't do any harvesting, and kind of thoughtful harvesting on a portion of the land. The Harvard Forest, which has studied Massachusetts forests for a century, has a wildlands and woodlands policy that they've been trying to expand over the last 10 years. And it has, thoughtful forest management to provide some products for us, and then some other parts of the forest, especially the older forests that are in sites that are not likely to be disturbed by all the hurricanes and, all these other bugs and funguses that are coming. The resilient forests, and be careful how we manage. There was a study by a professor, Chad Oliver at Yale, that looked at using wood instead of concrete and steel for building, which is an increasing trend. There's a lot of benefits to doing that, because wood is much lower carbon usage to make it than concrete and steel. And the wood, as Bill mentioned, is half carbon. So a wood building is sequestering a lot of carbon for the life of the building. Not to say that we should cut all our forests down to make wood buildings, but we need a balanced approach that kind of tries to look at the pluses and minuses of all this. I mean, Bill is correct. Leaving the forest alone gets the most carbon.
Yeah. And the other thing is that there's a lot of controversy over the accounting on how much better wood buildings are than other materials. Because often they don't count all that large emission that comes from just the harvesting process. I mean, usually only roughly half of the carbon makes it into the sawmill, and less than half of it makes it out as lumber. I mean, not all of that makes it out as lumber because of the sawdust and everything else. So it's and another interesting thing is they're building a new arena out in Seattle. Called the Climate Pledge Arena. It's being paid for by Jeff Bezos out of his I'm going to save the world from climate change fund. And they're using a new kind of concrete where they actually capture carbon dioxide from combustion and bubble it through the concrete, and it absorbs about, some very large amount of it, reducing the total carbon emissions from concrete. So there are changes taking place on the steel side where they're using more renewable energy to make the steel, and the concrete side. Just in September at Climate Week in New York, the world's largest cement company, Holcim, and they've merged with Lafarge, I think, in Europe, claims that they will be having zero emitting concrete in the coming decades, and they've already reduced it by 30% or something. So, it's a moving target, these things, and so we need to keep open for that. And it's these cross-laminated timber buildings are, we have to be a little careful. When they tried to build the new College of Forestry at Oregon State University, it collapsed during construction because of the delamination. So that wasn't good. It cost several $1 million to rectify that. So we shouldn't rush in to do technologies without being sure that they really work and that they really deliver as advertised.
Well, I would ask people to go out to UMass Amherst and look at the wood building that they built there, which is just remarkable and seems to be holding up pretty well, as are the mills that were built a couple hundred years ago out of wood. So,
Yep.
and I think concrete currently is like 7 or 8% of the emissions in the world. So they've got a ways to go before they're going to be no emissions.
But they are working on it. I mean, the point is that all of the industries are taking this at all seriously, except for, you know, the coal industry perhaps, are taking it seriously, and the bioenergy industry isn't taking it seriously. But other than that, people are doing, you know, are trying to move forward, and we ought to encourage that. Just a question on, you know, it is the case that under Chapter 61, if you have forested land, you can get a local property tax abatement if you agree to manage it for harvesting. And there's another provision about keeping land in agriculture. And there's another provision about conservation lands, but not many people know about that. But there's nothing set up specifically that if you kept your forest land in growing for carbon storage, that you would get a tax abatement, which I think should not come out of the local property tax, because that's benefiting everybody in the Commonwealth and should be more widely spread. In fact, I'm not even sure that the ones that do come out of the local property tax, being out here in Western Massachusetts, where we have a lot of that, and needless to say, there's resentment towards it on the part of many people because of the property tax abatements that people get.
It's basically just shifting the tax to the people that aren't in the program, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, there, like you said, there is this 61B, which doesn't require forest harvesting and is a, you know, substantial reduction. I mean, I think carbon credits need to be more easily obtained for forests, small forest parcels like we have. You know, we don't have like, you need like thousands of acres to break even on the cost of getting a carbon credit. And we need to find ways to make that more user-friendly for small landowners like we have in Massachusetts. So,
right.
And I mean, I think the carbon credit is kind of, the less you cut, the more you get of a carbon credit, right? I mean, the growth of the forest can be all harvested like they do in Maine to make products, or none harvested and you get the whole carbon credit. So, you know, having that as an option is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can't make that happen. We'll work on that.
We're working on it.
I'll be glad to, I am too. We should work together on it. Be a good thing to do.
Good.
Well, I'm so glad if our meeting tonight brought the two of you together to work on that. That's really great.
Bill and I both have geothermal heating and cooling, and Bill was the one who recommended the system that we bought. So I'm always indebted to him every time I see how cheap it is to heat and cool the house.
It's amazing, isn't it, Bob? Why would you do it any other way?
Yeah. Well, that's the way we're going to get to net zero for the housing sector, is through a lot of heat pumps.
Yeah.
So I was informed by Christine Muir that we had a hard stop at 8:45. So I'm not going to ask another question because we don't have time to answer it. And here's Christine.
Sorry about the hard stop. There are still a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I can copy and paste that into maybe a Google Doc that I can share with all of the panelists, and you can contribute some answers. I will be sending up a follow-up email to everyone who's registered by the end of the week with a link to this recording, which will be posted to our YouTube channel, with the resources that Jerry listed in his presentation. And if we get some more answers in a Google Doc, I can also share that with everyone who's registered. So I can do that because I hate leaving questions unanswered for people. On behalf of the library, I would like to thank everyone who attended. Thank you for your interest in this program. Thank you for your engagement with all of the questions. Thank you to Rick and Marcia and Charlie and Jerry and David and Chris for participating, and especially thanks to you, Bill and Bob, for speaking, being our primary speakers, and giving us all more information about trees. This is clearly a very popular topic in Lexington, and I think this is a good start to a long conversation. So thank you to everyone. If anyone else on the planning committee wants to pop in on video or just say any final words, feel free.
I just want to thank, on behalf of the other organizers, our speakers tonight for extremely fine presentations that I wish could have gone on at least twice as long as they did. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you very much.
Good to see you, Bill.
Yep, good to see you too, Bob.
Well,
Thank
thank you
you.
again to everyone. Good night to you all, and watch for the email later this week with all the extra information.
Great.
Okay,
Here.
thank you.